The idea that Plato was a fascist might seem obvious if you already know about this item from ancient Greece, the fasces, from which the term fascism is derived. A fasces was a bundle of sticks or rods tied together, usually with an axe head protruding from it. The fasces was both a symbol and a weapon carried about by certain Greek soldiers to indicate their connection to the magistrate. The use of a fasces by the state was assumed and expected, and nobody defended the state more loudly than Plato. So to say he was a fascist might seem unnecessary. But it is necessary to point out Plato's philosophical fascism because we've been taught that Plato was a great supporter of ideals, like free speech, justice, democracy, and of course harmony. But if we look critically at what we've been taught and compare that narrative with the actual writings of Plato, we find that he was actually one of the first proponents of full-on fascism. And we can see the roots of his fascist views in his elitist family tree. His father's name was Ariston, and Plato's own name was similar, Aristocles, as Plato was just a nickname. The names Ariston and Aristocles are both derived from the word Aristos, meaning best, from where we get the elitist term aristocrat. Ariston was said to be descended from Codrus, who ruled as the last king of Athens 4 centuries before Plato was born. Plato's mother, Perictione, was descended from Solon, the archon of 600 BC. Perictione was a close friend to Socrates and tried to use her own elitist influence to commute his death sentence. One of the charges against Socrates was that he'd turned a blind eye to the atrocities of the 30 tyrants, who murdered over 1,500 people and confiscated their wealth. It wasn't at all unusual that Perictione wanted Socrates' charges dropped. She also turned a blind eye to these atrocities because the violent leader of the murderous 30 tyrants was her first cousin, Critias. Plato also turned a blind eye to his behavior and praised him and his family through the character of Socrates in his book Critias. So you can see that Plato descended from a band of controllers who were busy perfecting what Plato would later call the art of herding human beings, a group he viewed as little more than animals. Some of his ancestor Solon's laws help us better understand what would eventually become Plato's proto-fascist philosophy. Plutarch reported one of these laws, which ordains that he shall be disenfranchised who, in time of faction, takes neither side. With this law, Solon was legally mandating duality, and society is still encouraged to take sides today. Another more well-known law was Solon's Sysoctia. This law forgave all mortgage debt and released the poor from debt slavery. It's a law used by the mainstream historical narrative to venerate Solon as a benevolent and wise ruler. But one feature of his Sysoctia law that's rarely discussed was its debasement of the Athenian currency. Through the Sysoctia, Solon altered the original Attic standard that 1 silver drachma should weigh 6 grams. Solon reduced that weight down to 4.3 grams. This was one of the earliest acts of inflation of the money supply, a form of theft through monetary policy. But the Encyclopaedia Britannica simply calls this debasement of the currency a reform, and states that Solon strengthened the economy. This is just another example of the mainstream historical narrative hiding history, completely failing to explain the truth of a government's economic policy that steals from its citizens. Harvard economist Joseph Schumpeter noted Plato's fascism in 1954. If we do insist on forcing Plato into a straitjacket of our own making, the fascist straitjacket seems to fit somewhat better than the communist one. Plato's constitution enforces a strict regulation of individual life, including severe restrictions upon freedom of speech. It is essentially corporative. Schumpeter was describing fascism here as limiting individual freedom, as it pertains to both wealth and speech. And this is key in defining fascism. It's a war against the individual. If we look at the etymology of the word fascism, it derives from fasci, meaning a bundle or grouping. Fascism, whether it's political or economic or social, is all about the primacy of the group over the individual. Fascism is usually described as the government's cartelization of the private sector. A cartel is a guild or association attempting to collude or conspire. They make an agreement not to compete with one another, to work together to keep prices high. The word cartel derives from both Greek and Italian words for paper or chart, suggesting an agreement or collusion on paper. Normally, competition between firms means one corporation might charge less than another in an attempt to win over more customers. For this reason, competition is seen as beneficial for the people, and forming cartels is seen as harmful to the people. But why would the government want to cartelize firms? Or more to the point, why would a government want to be fascist? The long answer is because the government regulatory agencies are made up of members of these colluding firms. The short answer, these corporations are the government. And because cartels benefit corporations, and because the corporations make up the government will legalize their formation of cartels. The term corporate means group, from the Latin word corporatus, meaning formed into a body. This means to collect many people into one body, and this new corporate body becomes a fictional individual, just as corporations are now legally defined as persons. But remember, the etymology of person is the Latin word persona, meaning mask, a character in a play. It's the citizen or the consumer as the individual who is exploited by the corporate legal structure, also known as the state. And this all goes back to the ancient roots of fascism or groupism. So what did Plato have to say regarding the fascist primacy of the group over the individual? As mentioned earlier, Plato was unimpressed with human individuals and viewed them as little more than animals to be shepherded. In Plato's myth of individuals are shown before birth into the world as being assigned a genius to direct and regulate their lives, suggesting these individual souls would lack the ability in life to govern themselves. And this is where Plato corrupts music to make a corrupt economic and political argument. Plato's focus on harmony, especially social harmony, is code for downplaying the individual, or downplaying the melody expressing the individual note. His dismissal of melody in favor of harmony has been largely ignored. But Brahms saw it. Rousseau saw it. Albert Einstein saw it. And now perhaps you see it. Like many who have come after him, Plato was concerned with the greater good. In Plato's philosophy, society takes precedence over the individual. And he wrote in Book 3 of the Republic that individuals have to do what they believe to be best for the state. That's fascism in a nutshell. His title for the book, The Republic, tells us something. The word republic derives from the Latin words res and publicus, meaning that a republic is simply a public entity. The word democracy, a concept Plato did not support, derives from the Latin words demos and kratia, meaning a situation in which the people hold power. Plato did not want individuals holding power over themselves or others. He wanted only specific, tested philosophers to be given the job of ruling and performing what he called in The Statesman the art of hurting human beings. A central feature of fascism is the flat-out rejection of free speech. So what did Plato have to say about the issue of free speech? In his book Laws, Plato wrote, "Those poems shall be sung which are composed by men who are personally good and honored in the state. The adjudication of these shall lie with the educator and the rest of the law wardens, who shall grant them the sole privilege of free speech in song. Whereas to the others no permission shall be given, nor yet shall anyone venture to sing an unauthorized song." The act of limiting human expression certainly ran in Plato's family. Though the ancient Greeks are often credited with promoting the concept of free speech, this right did not exist under Plato's ancestor Solon. Plutarch tells us that Solon legally forbade speaking ill of the living in temples, courts of law, public offices, and at festivals, and that the transgressor must pay 3 drachmas to the person injured, and 2 more into the public treasury. This law was in addition to Solon's prohibition of speaking ill of the dead and of crying loudly at funerals, as well as his legal restrictions on how far a wife could verbally persuade her own husband. But more than limiting speech, fascism focused on the concept of the group or state taking precedence over the individual. According to the Catholic Encyclopedia, the ancient Greeks had a form of group association called heteria that corresponded in its characteristics very closely with the modern corporation. Solon is said to have encouraged the formation of such bodies, and in his legislation permitted them to be instituted freely and to engage in any transactions not contrary to law. This aligns with the corporatist aspect of fascism discussed by the economist Schumpeter. And corporatism is the structure underlying today's modern form of fascism, known as the corporate state. Let me point out again that such government control over the economy has nothing to do with capitalism, which is an economic system based on capital or saved resources. Capital requires that consumption be deferred. Savings may exist in a fascist economy, but if the government is intervening in the markets, elevating corporate protections over the individual, removing corporate competition through federal regulations, that is not capitalism, that's corporatism. In the early 20th century, progressives like George Bernard Shaw helped form the corporatist British Union of Fascists, though he publicly described himself as a communist rather than a fascist. The Union published an outline of the corporate state, claiming that the nation was an organism of a higher order, transcending the individuals. This philosophy, in which the state takes precedence over the citizen, is taken right out of Plato's writings and is why he is accurately described as a fascist. Just thinking about the legacy of Plato and how many corporate states exist today, one of the most fascist nations in the world would have to be the United States. It's true that in the US, a right exists protecting speech, but the main feature of fascism, promoting the group over the individual, remains. The mainstream narrative tells us that the fasces in our national symbology represents our union, but it predates the Civil War by several presidents and actually represents our corporate state. I'm grateful for any feedback. Please leave your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching.